Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today. We have a great panel here. I'll get to our participants in a moment, but approaching this topic, it reminded me of the story that David Foster Wallace, the novelist, told when he was giving a commencement speech, and it was about two fish swimming in the sea, two young fish, and they were having a nice day, and they passed an older fish, and the older fish said, "Water's great today." And they kept swimming, and then the two young fish said, "Water? What's water?" The idea being, when you're in it all day long, you don't know that you're in water. And that's how I think about data. I've got an Apple Watch on, I've got this thing going, and I've got a phone somewhere. It's just emanating data all the time. I'm sure it knows where I am and what I'm doing. And so data is totally surrounding us, and it's become just sort of like part of everything we do. And so much is known about us that we don't always know that is known about us. So anyway, we have a great panel today. Data affects the way we play, the way we work. It affects our news and our economy. We approach it with a mixture of fear and optimism all at the same time. Should it be regulated, and how much? Of course, it should be some. So to talk about trends and how to accelerate ourselves toward our goals, we have a lovely panel here. So we have Subha Tatavarti, who is the CEO of Wipro, CTO of Wipro. André Kudelski is the chairman and CEO of the Kudelski Group. And Christian Lang is the CEO of TradeShift. And down on the end, we have Brett Solomon, who's the co-founder and executive director of Access Now. And so I'm going to start with you, Subha. Let's talk about how does Wipro use data? Let's just start with the basics. It's a big part of what you do, AI solutions. So just kind of give us an overview.
Thank you for the question. Data is so fundamental to your point, and it's so pervasive, Nicholas. We don't really harness even 30% of what exists out there. As we all know, Wipro is a technology services company. We are here to provide for optimal, out-of-the-box solutions for our customers to solve for their business problems. And one of the key fundamental aspects of our service is our technology talent. A lot of data and insights go into how we tap into the right technology talent, how we make sure that they are available just in time to solve for difficult and interesting problems for our customers, and also to see how we can upskill them, train them, and make sure that we are taking care of them on an ongoing basis. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is we use data for both to guide us for making decisions to grow our top line as well as bottom line growth. Coming from a very data-informed organization to a data-driven organization is the transformation that we're undergoing under Thierry's leadership. And you touched upon a little bit about AI. AI is the second building block. If data is the first building block for a sustainable economy and a sustainable growth for an organization and a company, I believe truly that AI is that next second building block, which actually sits on a reliable source, data source. We use data AI internally to optimize for our customer solutions, to build the right kind of platforms for them, as well as to enhance our employee experience. But we also use AI in many other forms and in different ways. We are actually going to be collaborating very soon with some of the large pharmaceutical companies to figure out a way to solve for precision, essentially around precision medicine. We are collaborating with chips providers and other semiconductor businesses to bring to them the use cases that require for them to modify or even enhance their product offerings. So in our business, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, it drives the top line growth for us by engaging with customers in ways that most likely we were not able to engage previously, and also to optimize for our business.
Thank you, Suba. You raised a lot of interesting points there, and I hope we can get back to them as the conversation goes on. André, tell us about your insight into small and medium-sized enterprises from your perspective as CEO of the Kudelski Group, and also you operate the Swiss Innovation Agency, and given all that, you have a perspective into this, and what I'd love to hear from you is, how does the ecosystem need to evolve to get to where we need it to be?
The first element to consider is that there is not only one approach to data. If you take the European continent or the US, you have very different perspective. Typically in Europe, people start by regulating and after look what can be done. In the US, first people do, and after try to find solution to regulate. Having said that, one of the key feature of data is that you are able to solve problems that you were not able to address before. We see many things happening in the e-commerce in elements that are the visible side of the internet. But if we look at all the elements that are related to medicine, to oncology, you have a lot of things that you will not be able to do in the future if you don't have data. But the question is, you may only have data if you are allowed to collect them. And then you need to have solutions that make that the patients, that makes that the authorities are feeling safe about that. But you have also to consider that you have two different types of data. Some data that have only a relevance now and for the next, I would say, 10 days. Some data that are gaining value with time. And that are the one where we need really to think ahead. And typically, I see that for many SMEs, there are some opportunity to build new capability, new functionality on data. But if the privacy and the question of how you can use data is not well thought in advance, you may be really having trouble, not now, but 3 years, 5 years from now. And that is really important to ask yourself the right question. And by the way, I'm also involved in what is called the Swiss Digital Initiative, where we try to look at the responsibility of the person that are looking at data in a way that people can trust that data are used in a constructive way.
You're getting at one of the real tensions I hope to explore in the panel, which is the more data we have, the more access we have to it, the more we allow corporations and product makers to use it, the nicer things are. But there's real perils to that, and we'll discuss a lot of those perils and where that balance is. We'll try to get there. Christian, I know you have some thoughts on this. You're the CEO of TradeShift, which is a fintech firm, and you're immersed in data from day to day. So big picture, how do you think data can power growth, and how do you think it can do it responsibly?
I mean, first off, I think, data has been at the heart of the consumer revolution we've had the last 10 years. And I think if you ask most consumers if they like the trade they've done with their data versus the services they've gotten, I mean, just think about stuff like Google Maps. It's completely unimaginable, 15 years ago we could have a service like that, right? So I think overall, it's at the heart of innovation. And I think if we're going to keep innovating at this pace, we need to make sure that it's accessible. I think there's a big challenge right now. You talk about the tension between the US and Europe. I want to probably draw a much sharper line than that, and that is one of these continents have a lot of large cloud computing companies, another one don't. And I could be afraid a lot of the data policy regulation we see right now in the EU is essentially just trade regulation by another name. And I think that has a lot to do with the direction of the companies and the revenue that's happening there. I think as the world and the field we are in, supply chains get more and more complex, one worry I have is, like, we, for instance, look at, we can do a pretty good picture on forecasting GDP data, right, 6-9 months ahead, because we're looking at all the purchase orders. But we need to collaborate with a lot of other companies to really paint that picture much more detailed, which would be incredibly beneficial to policymakers, regulators, to anyone who actually want to understand what goes on. But actually, with most of the regulation we have in the EU right now, that's incredibly hard to do. So I think one of the things we've got to figure out is that I think we have a tendency to look right now at data as a liability or a challenge or a problem that needs to be contained. And I think what we really need to move to is that there's enormous value here that we need to unlock. And in fact, it's a little bit like a cockpit in an airplane. If we don't have access to our instruments, if we don't know our altitude, there's a real chance we crash this airplane. And I think, look at global supply chains right now. I mean, the largest driver for inflation, I would argue, is actually not just cost in supply chains, it's a coordination problem. Because there's massive inventories in certain places and other places where there's absolutely lack of stuff, right? We see companies buying dishwashers and taking them apart to use the chips in cars. And that's a coordination problem, and we need to coordinate data to solve that.
Thank you very much. Brett Solomon, as the co-founder and executive director of Access Now, you regularly engage with companies and governments of all sizes, and you have very strong opinions on the human rights of people around, I guess all humans are people, of data, privacy. And so tell us about that.
Well, thanks. And thanks for inviting me on the panel. It's always good and interesting, I think, to be on a panel with representatives of industry, because one of the great things about the World Economic Forum is that you also get to exchange ideas and thoughts. And obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about innovation and kind of entrepreneurialism, I guess, as a result of data. And even the framing of this session was about, the public is now asking for a more responsible use of data. But as you say, and thanks for the prompt, the right to data protection and to privacy are actually human rights. So more so than just the question of, innovation or a question of what the community wants, it's actually international law. And the protection of our rights is absolutely fundamental to that. And that's why I think it's important for, CEOs and for governments to understand that it's more than just innovation that we're talking about. It's the fundamental underpinnings of our digital society and our human rights in the digital age. And we're seeing how important data is to companies, how important data is to governments, and how important data is to the community. And when we start to think about data, not just about supply chains, but actually about biometric data, when we think about our eyes and our irises and our faces and so on, like this becomes extremely important to think about it as within a rights framework and not just within a commercial framework. I want to give a couple of examples, if I can, maybe a little controversial, but obviously many of us have been following the decision or the leaked decision in the US Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade, which is about a woman's right to an abortion. But actually, the real legal discussion here is about the right to privacy. And so, we saw after that leak happened, we saw all of these fertility apps and fertility clinics being very concerned about the data that they hold and the implications for law enforcement in the US if abortion becomes illegal in 50 states, and also, of course, how to secure that data as well against vigilantes in a kind of very polarized environment and on a polarized issue. The second one that I wanted to raise is, I think many of us have also been tracking the issue of Pegasus, which is the spyware which has been used promoted by the NSO Group or owned by NSO Group. That company has actually now been listed by the Department of Commerce and Treasury as a kind of on the entity list as being blacklisted. But the reason why is because you can see now that Macron had Pegasus on his phone, and so did Boris Johnson, and so do human rights defenders, and so do journalists and bloggers all across the world. And it goes to show in both of these examples that when we think about data, that we need to think about the real serious human consequences of what's behind those figures, and how important it is that if we look at the most egregious example would be Khashoggi, who also had Pegasus on his phone. My point is that the data is neither neutral and it's never secure. regardless of what anybody says, it's never secure. And so while it can be a great source of innovation, it can also be used as a weapon, and it can be used to expose, and it can even deny you your right to life.
I told you we'd discover some tension on the panel. It's great.
Well, I think, but I mean, and that's why, again, why it's important to have these conversations, because we do also see the potential and the innovation and the entrepreneurialism and the, from a humanitarian context as well, like how important, data is to decide where tents go and where shelter is needed, etc.
Yep.
But there is this flip side, and you talk about the peril, so.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, let me offer two. I was talking to Christian a little bit before the panel. We were talking about the need to be careful with privacy. It's obviously, it's probably a human right, as you say, but there's a cost when you start to limit data usage. Two small, one silly examples, one that's more close to home for me. A silly example is on social media from time to time. You'll see people complaining about the advertisement that's been shown to them. And I noticed a major uptick in this in the past several years, as every platform's had to ask you if it's okay to track you. And of course, most people say, no, it's not okay to track me. Now they're getting bad ads. Now that's an inferior user experience for that person. And so, and then here's a less silly example. Apple made a big deal about how they were going to no longer allow certain types of data and behavioral tracking on the iPhone, or at least they were going to make apps ask you. And so one of the places I've seen this come home to roost is in Facebook. So Facebook says, Facebook has cut the amount that it pays to publishers, like mine, like many others in the industry, has gone down a lot because they have inferior advertising, and it means there's not quite as good revenues, and that cuts into newsrooms and means that they can't be as well staffed. So with that, I'm trying to tee you up, Christian, to talk about some of the dangers of over-regulating privacy. And so how do you feel about that?
I mean, I think first off, just to take your second example of Pegasus, that's a highly legal breach of devices, right? That's not a data privacy issue. That's a illegal hacking of computers and devices, and we have a lot of regulation. You go to prison for that, right? So, and of course, if it's a commercial company, you've got to figure out where to try it and how to try it, but I think it's a very clear use case. I think hacking Macron's phone is clearly legal, just as it would be to hack mine or yours, right? It's very different from giving consent to sharing your data on an online site. I think, you are right that data can be misused, but I think right now we are using very broad strokes to classify vast amount of data under the same umbrella, right? The fines for GDPR are exactly the same as if I leak, and most people don't know this. If you have an email address in the company where you work, it's considered PII, personally identifiable information. If I leak that, the fine is as big as if I leaked your social security number. Right? That is completely silly. In fact, it's ridiculous. Many companies post the email addresses of their employees so you can reach them, which is, you would think, a normal function for a company. So I think, again, we got to be very careful with how broad a brush we are using to paint this, and also with data, you can always paint up these extremely dangerous scenarios. I get that, and a lot of them are scary. But if you actually really go down and say how many consumers have in reality been hurt in Europe by, and how many, maybe even more importantly, has now been saved because they have 50 more pop-ups to click on every single website. I wonder what the consumer value or protection is of that, right?
And Brett, we're going to get back to you because I know you have answers to a lot of these challenges. But I want to bring in you two. And Suba, let's start with you. You're in a position of having to make calls around where that line should be, where should function kind of push up against privacy. How do you think about it, and what's some tough calls you've made?
See, I agree with both. Because, and that's true, that's a reality. I think all of us live in that almost the gray area, right? Is this the right thing? Is this the wrong thing? What am I doing? Is personally identifiable information like email, is it okay for me to share or not? The fundamental fact here, in my mind, is about responsibility and governance, and making sure that the policies are not something that is after the fact, but are at design time. From a technology perspective, that's what I'm thinking. Because all policies are of no use to me if there is somebody who does an audit after the fact. It has to be built as part of your design principles when you are building an app or system, a platform, or even your Apple Watch. And the idea there is you bake in the right policies at implementation and implement them at runtime such that 90% of those issues do not arise. So that's one. Second is you always need after-the-fact audit. You always have to have that. Data at rest and data in wet motion or in transit has to be constantly being looked at. There are companies that we work with that are doing this 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. Every time I look at, they start with one data and then data store, and then they go around and then restart again. And the reason for that is you need those kinds of checks and balances. But I don't think anyone in this room will argue that the innovation that we use to save lives or predict disasters or what have you has evolved because our ability to harness on not just data but technology. So we need to be able to somehow constantly try to strive balance. And I think that's what the key is. That's my opinion at least.
All right, André, you mentioned in your remarks that where you think people fail at this balance is when they think about the time horizon which data is useful. What did you mean by that?
Just to say that you have some data that are valid for a very defined period of time. If you are trying to sell a ticket for a concert, this information will be relevant during a very limited period of time. If you have some elements that by adding all the data together, you can find and predict some disease that the person will have, that's something that is materially different. Now, in the same way as not all data are equal, it's the same thing about people. I think it's important that people that do not want to have their privacy being challenged or having some data that are disseminated should be able to ask to get a protection. But on the other side, people that want to get benefit from the usage of data in a way that can prevent some future diseases would be able to do it. In Switzerland, we have had a pretty interesting debate on the question, if someone is passing away, can we take his organ to give that to people that need them? And that is the typical type of discussion where you shouldn't consider that everyone has the same opinion. And what we are very often missing, we think that all people are having the same approach and that we should impose things to people. Some people care about privacy, some people care about other things, and it's important to respect the difference between people.
Yeah. So Brett, one of your points, and this is your opportunity to respond to whatever you've heard that you disagree with, but one of your points is that this is a human right, and it should not be determined by the markets. So who should make these calls?
So, I think it's historically problematic when you put human rights to market forces. I think we can look across any right from, if we look at the environment, for instance, like the market has demonstrated that our right to a clean environment and to a safe future has not delivered the kind of rights that we would want for ourselves and our kids and our grandchildren. Generally, human rights, it's the responsibility and the duty holder is the state. The state's responsible for the protection of citizen rights. And we have an international legal framework that provides a lot of jurisprudence and a lot of guidance on how to ensure those rights are protected. But obviously, business now also plays a very significant role, perhaps even an equal role, and in some places a more than equal role than states. And so there are the guiding principles on business and human rights that make it very clear what are the responsibilities for companies, the respect and protect framework, and remedy, I might add, as well. But I think that the dichotomy that I'd like to move away from, if I could, is that it's either like innovation or data protection. I think that's a binary that it's kind of been thrown at us, but I don't think it's the case. I think that, you know, companies now know that there's a lot of value to be gained from the use of data, but they also know that their customers and their users, and obviously some companies don't have, you know, a retail front, but are also demanding a change in the way in which data is used. You know, this whole idea about like data is the new gold and data is the new oil and so on. I think it's now become clear that, you know, over the last couple of years, and I think partly as a result of the GDPR, that, you know, data is value and who has that value. And again, I come back to, it's not a proprietary right, it's actually a human right. I also, just to pick up on the point on Pegasus, your point about, you know, it's sort of it being illegal and so on, it's actually, like, I don't know of a jurisdiction where it is actually illegal. You can see that Pegasus is a, NSO Group, I should say, is a company that is market value of however many billions of dollars that it sits on the exchange, the stock exchanges of countries around the world, that there's actually very little protection against hacking. You know, we've got definitely cases now where Apple is taking NSO to court, and we're a part of that as an amicus brief. But there's actually very little jurisprudence around to protect users, individuals, whether you're the president or whether you're a person like you or me, to be protected. And I think that that's why it's absolutely essential. And I very much appreciated your point about the timing and how long does, you know, the value within data last, or does value actually accumulate over time? And this idea about data minimization, because I think data minimization is a very important principle that we can use for guidance that enables data protection, but it also enables innovation to take place.
Sure, André.
On the principle, data anonymization is a good thing, but if you look in reality...
I said, sorry, data minimization.
Oh, because anonymization, you have now way to really find out what was really happening. So basically, for data that people refuse to give directly, you can reconstruct the data through different techniques.
Yeah. I think just to make that comment on Pegasus before, my main point is just I think we're mixing apples and oranges if we're talking about you know, breaches of your phone with targeted malware versus companies asking for consent for you to use their site and their service for free, right? Like, I mean, you're right. I mean, obviously, protecting my privacy and data is a human right. But on the other hand, right, I mean, they're providing that service for free. And I think, you know, you could argue to say, well, for the users who opt out of giving their data to Facebook, should they then pay a fee, for instance, as an example? Is that fair? And I think there would be a lot of pushback from some quarters against that, right? So how, you know, I can't think of a lot of other industries where you essentially say you should provide your service for free. And by the way, if you start commercializing it in other ways, we will also regulate that, right? So, so it's an interesting dilemma, but I do think there's a very big difference between intentional breaches of phones with malware and then asking for consent on a website. And I think blurring those two probably paints the latter a little bit more darkly.
Yeah, no, that's fair, and I think that you know, this question of consent is kind of, you know, one of the sort of, I guess, a $64,000 question. You know, we were talking before about this, like, in the pop-up industry is like, okay, now I'm actively giving my consent to you. Before I didn't know that I was giving you my consent. Now, in a way, like, the regulatory framework is giving greater power to the corporate sector because, you know, you've taken the actual step of giving your consent.
I'm sure everyone reads the pop-up every time in depth, right?
But I'm talking at a more meta level, I guess, which is that, you know, I think many companies are like, well, what does it really matter if I track my customers? Or what does it really matter if I build an online profile of, my readers or whatever platform that they're in? But the reality is that those profiles, those profiles of us, those data profiles of us as individuals, they are being used in ways that we didn't consent to, and they are being, or have knowledge of at least, and they are also at risk as well. And I think the cybersecurity issue, is kind of, if you don't go for the consent issue, the cybersecurity issue is central to my point, because the most sensitive data that we're looking at the moment, I would say, is our health data, and it's become very clear as a result of the pandemic how important health data is to us as individuals. And we don't know where all of that information is in terms of the contact tracing apps, in terms of where it's being held by Big Pharma, etc. And what are the longer term consequences. And when it's tapped together with biometric data as well, I'm not just giving away the data of myself, I'm giving away the data of my my unborn children and their grandchildren as well. So I know I'm being dramatic about it, and I'm sorry to talk about worst case scenarios, but I'm also unapologetic about it as well, because I think it's important that we think about it in this larger framework, because it's not about individual companies, I know, and it's not about individual industries, but at a meta level, where we're up to at this point is that data is extremely sensitive. It is about us as individuals, and it's out in the ether without our control.
I want Suba to weigh in, but just people in the audience, get ready to ask questions. Raise your hand now. The microphone will come to you, but please.
Yeah, I just want I just want to take this conversation a little bit to the brighter side. I know it feels very dark.
I'm sorry to be worst
No,
case
that's
scenario,
fine, because it's important. But I think there is a lot to be said about the value of sharing clinical trials data amongst enterprises, as an example, and how it enhances your ability to innovate faster when it comes to really critical medicine saving lives. Cities are sharing data with mobility companies and within each other to be able, and opening it up as open APIs and open data sets to accelerate advancement in community services, right? Like you have a low-performing school in a particular district, what kind of data and what kind of test scores are coming out, how can we create certain programs, as an example, community outreach. Then there is other financial services consortiums that are bringing in together they are not only defining policies and programs to kind of say what kind of data is acceptable to share and what is not, but it also is helping in clamping down on fraud, risk, cross-border terrorism, the list goes on. Yeah. So I just want to kind of pivot this conversation a little bit, because although I agree with you, I think there's a lot of value that comes out of it as long as we're doing it responsibly, as long as it's aware and it's being transparent with the individual users and why we're using for what we're using. Of course, there will be enterprises who will take it and do stuff with it that they're not supposed to. But then that's the reason we have governing bodies.
I would love to go to the two more panelists who are hot to answer questions, but we're going to go to the audience if there's a question for us.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Steph Ifayemi. I'm a global shaper from London. I also work for the UK government on AI tech policy, so this is a very interesting panel. But two interesting points that came out is, Mr. Kudelski, you mentioned not assuming that everyone has the same opinion. We've also just spoken about the importance of people knowing how their data is being used, etc. But I think I actually have three questions, sorry, and we don't have to go through all of them. But the first one is, what processes do you think we could actually put in place to ensure that that we give people that decision-making power as to how their data is being used? But I think that there's a second part of that, which is the assumption that people actually understand the decision that they're sort of making at this point in time. And so what sort of education might we need to ensure that the explainability around how they make those decisions and the education is there? But then the third part is, I know we discussed the sort of value of data from a business perspective. But I think one of the interesting things is we spoke about the US and the EU, where potentially there are laws sort of governing the use of data to some extent. But if we sort of think about countries where there aren't necessarily legal frameworks around the use of data, the biometric data that we heard about, and metadata around local location, GPS, etc. Would, I think, Mr. Lang, your position around value change if you think about how data your navigation of data localization laws, for example, how would your views change if you are operating in a country where you don't assume that those legal frameworks are there and the data might be used in harmful ways? So 3 long questions, but hopefully you're able to answer them.
I think they're for you, Christian.
Yeah, so, and I used to work with the government as well a long time ago. I think the first thing on the consent question is extremely hard because, I mean, as you can see of GDPR and really trying to make consent more explicit, all you get is just people are clicking yes to get past it faster, right? And if you want to spend even more time explaining to people what they're saying yes to, you'll probably end up, and this has to do with user experience, annoying people even more. So I think, you know, you got to move this to a much more fundamental level, which means it's not at the point that I want to use a service that I'm consenting or not. I think in fact, I think consent is entirely the wrong mechanism. I think it's about education. I think we should teach people data literacy in school. And then I think we should say, hey, if you use websites, they will track your data, so just beware. Like, because consent is not a very good tool, honestly. And I think, you know, we use consent and explanations like this in financial services when you take a loan on your house, but that's also because that house can be repossessed. I don't really think the consequences of using Facebook is close to that, but we are approaching consent frameworks that are close to what we use in the financial service industry for using Facebook in Europe, right? So I think there's a bureaucracy measure versus value and potential danger. And now, that's not true for all types of data and all scenarios. Healthcare data is a really good example where I think we should probably spend more time on consent. I think the other problem here is with a lot of this, for instance, healthcare, right? Like, I mean, one of the highest growth, and I know you will say the same, highest growth innovation areas right now in healthcare is using AI to mine data sets on patients. And the problem with consent is we don't know what we're looking for, right? So we're using AI to go find those things and those patterns and those things we haven't seen, right? So how can we ask consent up front for what we don't know what we're going to find? And you know, for instance, you could look at cancer patterns, you can look at other things, and we might very well find out from external factors that you're at risk for cancer from some data we didn't even know was related to that. How could we ask consent for that up front? And the question is, would you like to know, right? So I think that's the other thing is a lot of the new and next generation innovation is not we're setting out to find that very specific thing. No, it is we're looking at the data and we're seeing what's emerging, and from then that we can build value. So I think that's maybe the last one. And then to operating in countries where you're not comfortable with the use of data, I mean, we just don't do it, period. If we were not comfortable with, or our customers are not comfortable with us operating, I mean, we operate in 142 countries, we operate in China, and you can talk about consent, we definitely explain to all of our customers what it means, right? And some customers, they come and tell us and say they will have one absolute guarantees that the data is safe from state actors, and I said, that doesn't exist, right? So you know, those are trade-offs you're gonna make, and we leave it. We have enterprise customers, so it's a little bit different. But we wouldn't want to operate in a way that our customers were not comfortable with. And again, maybe the last point, which also goes to your point about the market, which I actually widely disagree with. You said that, or as an example, right, like, you know, companies had created all the problems with climate change and then government has solved them. I mean, yeah, but I mean, in that direction, right? Like government coming a solution and private sector had caused a lot of the challenges. And I just want to say, I think, you know, if you look at, for instance, climate change, I'm not so sure, I mean, where are we with the pledges right now? And then look at what's happening with Tesla, with solar, with a lot of other things. So I think also with data, we need to involve private sector, and we need to stop looking at them as the big bad nemesis who just want to, you know, mine your data. Most companies, they want to have great brands, they want to have great customers, and they want to create great value, right? So I don't think, that might be bad actors, and we got to root them out, but I think the market is very efficient at doing that.
This is a great tension over here. So now I want to turn to you, André, but I did want to make sure that the audience got a chance to ask any more questions. I'm sure that I think this is a very questioning, curious audience. So there's got to be more questions out there. But André, why don't you answer while they get ready for asking the question?
Just one element. In some countries, the question is not if people accept fundamentally that. It's they are ready to not get some services because they do not want to have the data exposed. But having said that, I would just make one suggestion regarding the authorization or the disclaimer, rather than to have that primarily written by a lawyer, to have that written by the one that wants to make people dream by the new application of data. Take an example, rather than to have the lawyer of a pharma, to have someone that is in the research that explain what he's trying to achieve.
I think we can all agree
data.
lawyers should never write anything.
We can then have something that is much more, much more, how to say, aspiring than just an element where finally people don't read because they're just fed up.
It's a fascinating point that consent might not be the solution. You can kind of see it if you go to a website that says, do you accept the cookies? And everyone accepts. And then if Apple says, do you want to be tracked? And everyone says no. Well, are we all really thinking it through so much? Did we have a question? Was that a question? No. Okay, pointed at somebody and freaked him out. Sorry. Any more questions? Okay, yes, you did have a question. The power of suggestion.
Hi, I'm Sebastian Bukop. I'm working on technology policy here at the World Economic Forum. I thought the panel laid out really, really compellingly the reasons for and against sharing data. So that's wonderful. And I think we all agree that this is a tension that will never really be resolved. I think it's a tension that needs to be managed carefully. So we constantly need to work on it. So what I would like to hear, maybe from each panelist, is really one solution that you believe could work, something that surprised you, something that you believe could really move a very old debate forward, or maybe even change its direction.
Well, I mean, it would be a great start if the US had a data protection framework. We're all operating under the assumption that like the big democracies, like Australia does not have a privacy law. The US does not have a data protection or privacy framework in place. So for me, when we talk about all this unbelievable collection of data and extraordinary opportunities, having some legal framework in, you know, the GDPR does, but you talked also, I mean, the EU does, but if you talk about adequacy between the US and the EU, we're still working it out, and yet we're collecting all of this data. So I think something that would really change the game is if the US, and it is in play right now, if the US had a data protection framework passed by Congress, that would be an incredible game changer.
That's a big ask.
Yeah, but it's also possible as well.
First, they have to understand the internet. Okay. What's your solution? That's great.
I think almost I would go the other way and say I think it would be nice if that was a harmonized solution. And I mean, we got to ask the very pointed question about how EU is using this stuff also as trade policy. I'm sorry, but it is. And, you know, I mean, you read the legislation for the Gaia, the data cloud the EU is proposing, and you see the list of companies who's to build it. It's like Airbus, Siemens, you know, SAP, you just list a long list of European companies. And I'm quite, so I think, you know, we got to look at that harmonization. And I think maybe it's a matter for the WTO, maybe it's a matter for somebody else. But I think if we really want to have that harmonization, we got to have an honest talk about data not just being privacy, but also
define the term, harmonization. Define the term for me.
I think, you know, we've got to talk about, you know, I mean, I'm pretty sure the Americans would come and say we've got to talk about fair economic terms of using our data as well, right? It can't just be very specifically targeted against certain American companies. Okay. As if you read the legislation right now in the EU, a lot of it, you know, you could pretty much put the name of each company into each paragraph. Right?
Okay. André, solution time.
No, so I'm always quite skeptical when we try to solve issue through regulations. And even if some people ask to have less regulation, that will be a regulation to ask for less regulation. But having said that, for me,
I share your skepticism.
Probably there is an opportunity for innovation and to have an innovative approach to this question of data, and maybe to see one company coming with a charter or a description of why the company needs the data and what is the purpose. Yeah. It's to have something that is inspiring. Today, a lot of people do things with data, but speak as little as possible, and that is giving all the opportunity for people to think about conspiracy. And if a company would come with something that is quite inspiring to explain how we can save life, how we can do great things with data, that may give some idea to others and to be a positive emulation rather than restrictive regulation.
Okay.
Just as an idea.
Suba, solve it all for us.
No, I think it's transparency. I don't think it's an all-encompassing solution. I'm sure these three and many more need to be in place. But education and transparency. It's amazing. Magic happens when you're able to provide what you're using this data for, where will it be used, who I will be providing this data, even if it's anonymized, to my partners. The education and transparency, in my mind, makes a big difference. Because we'll never reach the extreme right and the extreme left of the spectrum. Heavily regulated environment will never be conducive for innovation and growth, as an example. Heavily unregulated environment can cause many issues that you just talked about, right? So I think, and transparency is one tool that I've seen, at least in my couple of years of experience with data, that works fairly well.
Okay, so I'm going to try to sum it up real quick before we say thank you, which is just to say solutions are the U.S. needs a framework, a data protection framework. We want to harmonize it, though, between global economies. I love this idea that if you want the data, why don't you describe what we're all going to get because we want it, right? Market it, try that. And then that could go hand in glove with transparency. And I like the idea of also saying, if consent isn't the way to do it, just imagining the thought experiment of what could be the way to reach this balance. So thank you very much, panelists. Thank you, audience, and thank you to the forum as well. We're done.
Yeah, absolutely.